White picket fence, green grass, a car in the garage of a house you call home. It's all part of the American dream. But what used to be a natural progression in young adulthood has now become an ever-widening chasm between home ownership and real life. It's a problem with so many parts, it's hard to know who to blame, much less how to fix it. My next guest is someone who thrives in this very kind of nuanced societal soup. He's an economics professor at George Mason University and a New York Times bestselling author who often questions social norms. Today, he's going to use his econ professor's superpowers to put into plain language the science and ethics of housing regulation as we ask the question, what's the real reason we can't buy a house? Contemplating the complex, questioning institutions, the self-described openly nerdy Dr. Bryan Caplan. Thanks for being here.
Fantastic to be here, Meredith.
So I think before we get right into it, can we please talk about your book? Because I was fully braced for highbrow. Like I was ready. I psyched myself up. And then I opened it. Imagine my delight when I found that it was a graphics novel. It was like a huge sigh of relief. I loved that
You weren't going to
chose
actually have to read a book about housing regulation with words?
Yes, right, exactly. I was totally psyched up. I was going to do that for you. I just want you to know that. But obviously, it was important for you to make a book like this in a way that was or felt accessible to those outside of the academic world. Why was that important to you?
Honestly, the big problem with academia is that we find out a lot of important truths, which then get communicated to almost no one. Most researchers, honestly, don't even bother publicizing the research. They don't do interviews. They don't try to write op-eds, just publish it in a journal and walk away. And that's bad enough. But even if you did go and talk to the media, who would listen? That's not enough either. So I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how can I make the most important research discoveries accessible and engaging to as broad an audience as possible. I started off with just trying to write better, actually editing the words, trying to make the language lively, thinking a lot about diction, about presentation, organization. Then, however, I was thinking, well, can I do better? Is there something else that I could do? Something where I could get more time out of people, where I could get them to learn more per minute. And that's when I started thinking about graphic nonfiction. By combining words and pictures, you can just communicate a lot more information per minute and probably get better retention. So yeah, that's what I did with my first nonfiction graphic novel, Open Borders, and that's what I'm doing with this book here. And yeah, I'm very aware that housing regulation is a really boring topic for most people. And the fact that the findings are really exciting does not actually help that much. What I'm trying to do in this book is to really immerse people in what I consider a shocking, exciting body of knowledge. And also, probably what gave an extra boost to doing this as a graphic novel is just realizing a lot of support for housing regulation is just aesthetic. I don't want to look at the houses that would be built without government. And so what I did in this book is try to actually show people a vision of what a less regulated world would look like, which I say looks really cool and better than what we have. Not worse, better. It looks better.
Well, you're right that it is an important topic to talk about and to unpack and put all this work into. But it is, I don't know, maybe it's more natural for us to want high tech, cool, flashy solutions like 3D printed homes and, tiny house communities. But those things can't exist with strict land use regulations. So even that is tied in with the regulation itself. But it's just a more eye-catching headline to say 3D printed homes will solve homelessness.
Mm-hmm. Right. Look, I'm 3D printing of homes. All right, it's an interesting idea. The main thing that motivated me is there's a big difference between stuff that we know that it works because it's been done a lot and it's now just hard to get the permission to do it, versus stuff that might be possible, but we don't really know because it's still in its infancy or just hasn't really been tried. You can just look at the Empire State Building, built in about a year, 90 years ago, and realize, why don't we do stuff like that very much at all today? And the answer is, look, we still have the technology. It's still known how to do stuff like that. It's just so hard to get all the permits to go and make millions more homes in New York City, and therefore it doesn't happen. But yeah, there is this big difference between government stopping stuff that we know is already out there versus maybe being in the way of something that could be done, but it's just hard to tell. Like for me, this often comes up in the context of people saying, oh, we need to get really cool new energy sources. Let's do geothermal. My reaction is always, look, we know nuclear energy works and is awesome. And the whole problem is just that it's almost legally forbidden to use it. What's the point of going and figuring out some totally new awesome energy source if once we come up with that, we know there's going to be a pile of regulation on that too? Why not just push back against the regulation of a thing that we know works rather than coming up with some totally new thing and hoping that government will allow it, which based on past experience, they won't.
So when you talk about housing regulation, we all acknowledge, oh yeah, that's a thing that exists. But what maybe we don't have a better grasp on is, what does housing regulation include? Can you kind of list out what is all included when you say housing regulation? What are we talking about?
Great question. So there's a standard list of regulations that are extremely costly that get the most attention. The basic list, first of all, restrictions on building height. It's so hard to build a skyscraper in America. The difficulty varies by the city, but nevertheless, it's really hard to do, even though they're physically not that hard to build, and they provide enormous amounts of housing if you are allowed to do it. Another big one in the US especially is there's a lot of extra regulation of multifamily housing. So if you want to build apartments or townhomes, extra hurdles on top of the normal hurdles. Then when you get down to just single family homes, the regulation there is the lightest, and yet it is totally standard to have a strict minimum lot size. If you've got 10 acres, very common to say, fine, you can build 10 houses. We need 1 acre per house, even though plenty of customers would be happy to get the cost savings of less land and yet generally illegal to offer it. There's also important regulations of parking. Here, it's really obvious for commercial properties because if you go to almost any shopping area, you'll see, wow, every day except Black Friday, they have plenty of extra parking spots almost everywhere in America. And the reason is total regulation. Generally, the parking law in the US for commercial properties is they have to build enough parking for all their customers on the busiest day of the year if they charge zero. That's how big your parking lot has to be. What that means is that on every day except the busiest day of the year, there's a bunch of wasted land, which could have been used to build something else, but that's illegal. There are, of course, lots of other regulations that probably matter too. They've been less studied and probably have a smaller effect. And are things like, do we really need to have 2 separate fire escapes for a skyscraper? If you just think about the geometry, when you build fire escapes inside of a skyscraper, that is carving out a section of the building that cannot be used from the top floor all the way down to the bottom floor. Right? And if you require 2 of those, then that is carving out even more. An architect that I was talking to said that the kind of land use regulations that my book mostly focuses on, that's probably about doubling the average cost of housing. And then the other regulations are adding on maybe another 20%.
Are you suggesting complete housing deregulation and immediately?
Yeah, great question. Let me just blow on my credibility as saying, yeah, I understand that hardly anyone agrees with that, and I'm not going to freak out about that. If you just listen to the main things that I'm saying, great. But in the book, I do say, look, first of all, the slippery slope is very bad in this area. If you go and read early proponents of housing regulation from the 1920s, they seem like totally reasonable people, and their complaints seem reasonable complaints. The problem is that once you open up to the door to the system where anyone with a complaint can go to the government meeting and stop things, then you get to the system that we have, which just crushes almost everything in any place that people want to live. Say it was much better in the old days when if you had a complaint against someone, you had to take them to court, which is a pain in the neck, and that's the point. It is bad to have a system where complaining is easy, where the burden of proof is on the person that's being complained against. There was a much longer system that went on from like the 13th century, the 20th century. We still have it actually, but it's not that important anymore. It's just called the law of nuisance. And essentially it meant that if one of your neighbors is putting a lot of noise or smoke, you can take them to court, but the burden is on you. You've got to show it's a serious physical invasion. You got to wait for them to actually do it. You can't stop them because you're worried that they might do something. And that, I say, was actually a better system. Similarly, for things like safety regulation, I know safety regulation is super important. Still, what I'll say is that there are very strong incentives when you're building something to not have it collapse. These are enough. right? If you're thinking about buying a house, you get an inspector. If the inspector says the stairway is going to collapse, you don't buy the house.
Right.
That, I say, is actually a better system than the one that we now take for granted. But yeah, if someone says, let's get rid of all the regulation except safety, I'm definitely going to say, great, let's just sign on that, rather than keep arguing that. But ultimately, I just think there's been a big misjudgment of how markets work. And the way markets work is you get what you pay for. And there is a reason why, if something's too expensive, there's a reason. It makes sense to say, okay, well, we don't need to go and reduce the risk from 1 in a million to 1 in a billion because it would double the cost. That's a totally reasonable perspective. This line that we heard during COVID, if it saves one life, yeah, that's terrible. Right? If we really believe that, we would still be on lockdown because COVID still kills a few people. It's just not a reasonable approach to risk.
So how would not having any housing regulations make the price of housing go down?
Yeah, it's really simple. When you have a lot less regulation, you can build a lot more housing. And how do you fill all that extra housing? You got to cut the price. If you've got a lot of competitors who are doing the same thing, yeah, they've got that is also further pressure to cut the price. The basic logic of when something is abundant, that makes its price go down, is clear for almost all industries. If you're running a lemonade stand and you can't sell your lemonade, gee, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? It's like, yeah, you made too much lemonade. You're going to have to cut the price to sell it. There is a lot of resistance, I know, to the idea this works for housing, and yet there's overwhelming evidence that, of course, it works. Furthermore, there's overwhelming evidence that if you don't let people build stuff, then prices go sky high. So take a look at San Francisco or Manhattan or any of the other trendy areas where they strangle the market. I mean, strikingly, there was some research saying that people are willing to accept the idea that when there is a fall in the supply of new cars, that raises the price of used cars. That's what happened during COVID. Right? This doesn't require a lot of training for people to say, yeah, I see that. But somehow for housing, there's an idea of what makes you think that these greedy developers would cut the price just because we're nice and we let them build more stuff. Like, look, this isn't reciprocity. It's not like, oh, thank you for letting me go and build this stuff. And now I'm so grateful. I'll make the housing cheap. It's not that story at all. It's the story of, if you build a lot more housing, how are you going to move those units? You've got to cut the price, especially if your competitors are also making a lot of new units.
So is this related to what you talked about in the book, manufactured scarcity?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Is that like toilet paper in 2020 during the pandemic?
No. So toilet paper in 22, yeah, that's actually a great question. So it wasn't manufacturing scarcity. Like, as far as you know, there's no evidence at all that toilet paper manufacturers deliberately started reducing production when COVID started. And in fact, they started increasing production. This is a great time to go and sell toilet paper. Manufactured scarcity is when there's something that's naturally very abundant, and yet there are rules that make it scarce on purpose. And housing is totally a great example of that.
So it's hard to imagine like no housing regulations because, most of us, that's all we know. And even actually you point this out in your book, which I really appreciate because as an economics professor, you do put your toe in the waters of psychology quite a few times.
Psychology is a great subject, and every economist that is badmouthed it is just crazy. Like, oh, well, who cares about the subject that studies how people think and feel? We don't need to understand that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, really, unless you only like to just look smart when you talk, you're responsible for making that person emotionally comfortable when you deliver the message and hopefully act upon said message. So I love that you do that. And one of the things that you paint the picture of in the book is how difficult it is to imagine stuff that we don't have. And that sounds like really overly simple, but in terms of regulation, we tend to have all these what ifs. And so I want to cover some of these what ifs because you do it great in the book. And so I'm hoping we can do it here too.
Thank you, Meredith.
You're welcome. And so
I did try.
You really did. It was actually super fun. My husband came over while I was reading. He goes, what are you reading? Are you reading?
Yes, I love stories like this. When kids read my books over their parents' shoulder, even better. That's right. I really did my job if a child wants to read it.
Exactly. It's super cool. So the first what if for me as a nature nerd is the environmental part of it, because in the West, we are not known for having a robust environmental ethic, right? And historically, when there wasn't regulation, it didn't go well. Like when we wanted to settle the Midwest and the West, there was native people already living there. So what did? We want to live there. We want to build houses essentially there. We're going to kill all but 300 of the buffalo because that's their food source. I mean, we just kind of go buck wild. You saw that with the beaver trade. You're seeing it now with overfishing in international, aka unregulated waters. How would this be different? Wouldn't this be kind of an environmental dumpster fire?
All right, so it's very important to understand that the difference between how people treat common property and how people treat private property. All those examples you're talking about, at least almost all of them, are about common property where nobody really owns it. Anybody can go and take what they can get, but nobody actually is the owner. On the other hand, the whole idea of private property is this is mine today. It's going to be mine in a year. It's going to be mine in 50 years. The only way it gets out of my hands is if I sell it to somebody else. Those give very different incentives. In the case of fishing, we got private fish farms. The fish farms never get overfished because one person owns that farm and he knows if I go and take every fish out of my own fish yards, then I'm going to have no revenue next year. On the other hand, when it's something is commonly owned or is really is unowned, that's where you have these problems. All the things that I'm talking about are specifically about letting people build what they want on their own property. So I'd just say that it's pretty much the opposite of that logic. Something that did not make the book, because just totally on an oversight on my part, was privatizing of government land, which I think is also a really big deal. If you've got something where you can go and hunt on federal land, but you just have a permit to do whatever you want for a month, and then afterwards it reverts to the government, yeah, that's another case where you aren't going to be very concerned about conserving the resource. On the other hand, if it's an actual ranch that you own, it's the opposite story. That's one where you're very concerned. So if you're thinking about anytime someone owns a piece of land, yeah, then they're considering, well, if I go and cut down all the trees, I can put in more houses, but it'll look less good, and that's going to reduce the price. What is going to be the optimal number of trees to keep up so that people want to live there because it's pretty, but also I can make more money by putting more people in? I mean, a lot of what regulation does now is essentially says, look, I don't care what people want. We're going to go and require you to give everybody an acre of land. Or I don't care what people want. We're going to go and make you keep half of this land as forest. I do think that is a mistake. And it is a big reason why housing is so expensive, is that you're basically saying, we're not going to think about cost. And honestly, you should always think about cost. That is, the problem with private property isn't that people think about cost. There's a problem when people don't think about future benefits. But again, the way you handle that is by putting it into the hands of an owner. There have long been proposals for things like privatizing fisheries and basically turning public fisheries into things that are more like fish farms, which I don't talk about in this book. But yeah, it's a really good idea. It's one where there's almost no argument against it other than I just don't want to do that.
Well, it's an interesting theory from a psychological perspective, and it checks out in sociological aspects.
Yeah, or just look at common kitchens and all the filthy dishes, or go and look at and then smell your work refrigerator.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the law of buy-in to, I think that's John Maxwell or someone, but that's really interesting. So how would deregulation be any different, though, from, say, the gold rush, where everyone is hurrying along to be the first, to build the fastest? Wouldn't that make housing quality go down, and there would be also poorly thought out infrastructure around those houses?
Would it make housing quality go down? See, like by a lot of measures, absolutely, and that's kind of the point. So if you say, isn't a home that only has a quarter acre lower quality than one that has a full acre? And it's like, yeah, but people have to pay for that extra quality and they don't appreciate it. It's better to have products that are in some sense lower quality but are cheaper. Right? And this is something that it's very hard for a politician to say. You don't want to be a politician saying, we need to get quality down so that things will be affordable. No. You want to go and tell people some nonsense of everything should be free and is the best quality ever done. It's like, yeah, you can't have both of those things. There's a trade-off between price and quality, and anyone who's honest will go and tell you that. Does this mean that it's a quality level that people should be afraid of? No. Right? If you're going and building a house, like anyone who is not a moron will at least say, I want to get it inspected and to see what's going on here. And that is the incentive. Like, don't want to go and build a house that's going to collapse and kill people and destroy the reputation of our company. There are strong incentives for your customers to be happy. I mean, what's pretty striking is that in real life, we see businesses paying very careful attention to small details of customer satisfaction. Just think about any time that you order something from Amazon or buy something from Costco. This is actually at a level where you can return it for any reason or no reason at all and get a full refund. Right? And you're like, why would any business do that? I remember my dad actually has a strange level of anger against Costco. He's like, I don't see how they can stay in business letting anyone return anything for any reason. God damn it. And it's like, look, Dad, it's Costco. I think they've actually got a pretty good business model here. And the business model is if everyone feels that every Costco purchase is fully returnable, no matter how ridiculous their complaint is, customers feel super comfortable buying almost everything. And therefore, you actually make more money. Right? Or just think about at a restaurant. How often does it happen that you don't like something at a restaurant, even a small detail, and the restaurant says, oh, tough luck. I don't care if you don't like basil. Right? So in our actual experience in markets, we see that businesses are generally extremely solicitous over even our most minor complaints. So the idea that they're going to go and build skyscrapers that collapse without regulation is, I think, just paranoia. It's something where anyone with half a brain will go and hire an inspector just to double check it. And if it's a large company, such as would build a skyscraper, they are risking their entire reputation with a small problem. And you'll see airlines being really worried about any possible issue. Why? Because if one United Airlines plane goes down, it is devastating for the entire firm. They are really worried about that. Some of that is regulation, but a lot of it is just we've got to protect our business reputation here. It's worth a lot more than just the money that we get on this one flight. Now, this question about infrastructure being poorly thought out, I mean, that's something where probably true. I mean, I'd say in general, infrastructure is poorly thought out. The main issue I would say there is, look, it doesn't really help that much just go and drag our feet indefinitely. We still have big problems. And probably the best solution, and the one that's most likely, is actually that the developers themselves will actually build almost all the infrastructure, and then at the end they deed it over to local governments. It's actually very standard where I'm in Virginia that it is in fact the developer who does the sewers, does the roads, does the electrical lines, all this stuff. And then at the end they deed it over to the government, but they're the ones that actually built it. I would say in general, if you were to say, look, we can't go and get rid of these regulations until government has all the time that it needs in order to make other things work, yeah, it sounds like it's never going to happen. And again, this is something where the developer definitely has incentive to do what they can to lean on local government to get them to do a reasonable job. Because again, if the sewer system is bad, it's going to be hard to sell your house at a good price. Mm-hmm. If the roads are crummy, it's going to be hard to sell your house at a good price. So these are all things where developers actually do have a very direct self-interest, because consumers do notice details, and businesses therefore are also paying attention to details as well as the big picture. Is this a place people are going to want to pay money to live in? And if not, then that's terrible for business.
I hadn't thought of that, because right now, common complaint among people who are shopping for homes, particularly newly built homes, is you've got these, like we have DR Horton here. It doesn't have a good reputation. So it's like the homes are quickly made, they're poor quality, but you're still paying a lot per square foot for
I would say I would say Horton has a very good reputation, just not the best. It's different. So actually, there were two communities right next to each other. There's Craftmark where we bought, and there was Horton right next to us. Horton was probably a little bit cheaper, but we went and compared, and we thought that we were getting a better deal overall with Craftmark. But obviously, there's a ton of people that could have lived in our neighborhood, and they chose Horton. And I don't think they were dumb people. I've talked to them. I think overall they are a bit less happy with what they got. But that's standard. You go and you pay top dollar, and you get a better product. That doesn't mean that everyone should do top dollar. If you just look at what vacation you could do, it's like, wouldn't it be better if you did the round the world cruise than just the 3-day cruise to Bermuda?
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's an interesting thought experiment to think about. If housing is deregulated, then would the consumer be savvier? Because it would be more obvious, like, oh, this is a lower quality house, therefore it is a lower price. But the struggle right now is, and it's been this way for a while, is like, oh, yes, sir, you will still pay $400,000 for that, and it's a piece of shit. That's what I'm saying. It is an interesting thought experiment to offer more obviously financially tiered choices to the consumer, and for them to essentially consent to what they're getting. Yeah, this AC is going to break in 5 years, but got your
Yeah, so I think
house.
you're right that with less regulation, people would take some more care. I think honestly, the reality is most people do not feel protected by government. If you look at actual behavior, like I've never heard someone say, well, I'm just going to buy this and I know nothing can go wrong because there's government regulation. No human in America says that.
Hmm.
Instead, it's like, well, I'm going to go and shop around and like, this isn't a very good deal, or I can pay a bit more money and get this. And that's how life actually works. Like if you go to restaurants, the thought that, well, there's restaurant where there's regulators that go and inspect the restaurants. It's like, does that actually make you feel much better? Like, no. Well, what makes you feel better is firsthand experience and reputation. You can just compare when people are doing online shopping. How often do you go and look at the stars of the reviews versus go and Google what does the Better Business Bureau say about this company?
True.
Right. And these are the differences. You can go and often find, like usually complaints against a business or public record, you can go and find out what people are saying to the government and what the government's response had been. Almost nobody cares about that because they just don't consider it a very useful thing to know. Whereas it's got 4.8 out of 5 stars. It's good enough for me. That is what's actually going on. What's pretty striking to me is people think about this theory of government is protecting them, yet when you look at their actual behavior, they don't seem like they feel very protected by government at all.
TSA
Instead,
is
it's
a
like,
great
yeah, like
example.
I've got to go and look out for me. And fortunately, I can go and look at reviews. I can go and get word of mouth. And also just going and looking at the warranties that they have. The first line of defense is just to complain and say, hey, I don't like my food's undercooked. And just imagine what we do if they would say, well, tough luck. If you don't like it, get out of the restaurant. Here's the bill. Right? Your reaction to that would probably not be to go and call the government and say, they went and they undercooked my steak and they refused to fix the problem. Instead, you just don't go there and you badmouth them, or maybe you give them a bad review. And that is the real system that gives us what we are currently getting. It's not perfect, but it's the system that people actually experience and believe in.
I want to shift gears a little bit into another area of affordability that is peripheral, but not peripheral at all, because it has to do with our personal income, of how we can even begin to afford or not a house whatsoever. And, we like to think of America as like the land of opportunity. If you work hard enough and are consistent, you will get whatever it is you're out to get. But you say that housing regulation actually limits social mobility and that it's part of the reason it's unaffordable?
Yeah. So there are a couple of great papers by a couple of economists, Ganong and Shoag, and here's what they found. If you go back to the U.S. between 1940 and 1960, thereabouts, you'll see that there is a very pronounced population movement from poor states to rich states. So people are leaving states like Mississippi where incomes are low, and they're going to places like California where incomes are higher. Right? Just think about Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. Of course, that didn't work out for the characters because Steinbeck was a communist and that was fiction. But in the real world, there was a long trend of people just getting social mobility the simple way, which is just pack your stuff up in your car and move to a place where wages are better. But then when the same authors took a look at the modern U.S. economy, they found pretty shockingly there's actually a tendency for people to move from rich states to poor states. So people are leaving places like California and going to poorer states, like where their incomes will be low. It's like, that's pretty weird. And the explanation which they put forward, and it totally checks out, is that in that earlier period, there was actually very little difference in house prices between rich and poor areas of the U.S. because there wasn't much regulation. So you could just build whatever you wanted. And as long as it was profitable, we kept building, bringing prices down to cost. So in the old days, the difference in earnings between areas was basically something you could just pocket. And the change in the cost of housing was very little, so it was basically a rounding error. Now, however, in areas with high wages, housing prices are generally much higher. So high, in fact, the typical American would lose money if they would move to a richer place. Mm-hmm. If you would move to a place where your occupation gets higher wages, generally you actually have a lower standard of living, not higher, because housing cost eats up more than 100% of the increase in pay. So that is a very important way in which we've got less social mobility, again, caused by housing regulation. Because, and again, just to understand the logic of how markets work, standard thing that happens in markets is if demand goes up, then you start making profits. But when you're making profits, this is basically a big bullhorn announcing anyone who makes this product will make profits. The way that markets normally work is when an industry is making profits, that leads to entry and expansion. And in the long run, that brings prices back down to cost. That still works in most industries, but if you need a bunch of pieces of paper from the government in order to enter, then it doesn't work anymore. And then you can have either prices stay permanently high, and particularly can stay permanently above just the actual physical cost of making the product. In the real world, often you might wind up spending so much on lawyers and everything else that burns up the cost, but that's just an artificial requirement that is tacked on and then inflates the price for everyone.
So here I'm in Pensacola, Florida, and here the median income for a whole house is $50,000. So pretty low. During the COVID lockdown, we had a lot of people who had well-paying jobs move to our area, in Florida in general, pay over asking price for the homes here. And we attribute that largely to the huge spike in our area of the housing price increase. How would deregulation help that whole thing?
So in the short run, your story, my story are the same. If a ton of new people show up and immediately want to buy right away, then that's going to raise prices. However, in a world where there's low regulation, this immediately means that developers are saying, oh my God, the price of houses is now way above the physical cost of making more houses. Let's make a whole lot of houses. I don't know the details of Pensacola housing regulation. Florida is actually one of the better states. But still, I think it's very likely you've got a bunch of regulations about how many houses you're allowed to put on an acre of land, regulations against multifamily. In your downtown, almost certainly it's really hard to build more tall buildings. And so in a deregulated world, all the things that are hard to do would be easy to do.
Yeah.
And they would do them, again, not because they want to help people or they feel sorry for people. It's just like Adam Smith said, not out of benevolence does the baker bake his bread, but from his own regard to his own self-interest. People don't wake up at 4 a.m. so that to help other people have bread. They wake up at 4 a.m. to make money selling bread to people that will pay money for it. It's a system that doesn't sound as good as one based on altruism, but it's much more reliable.
I spoke with a builder here in Pensacola to ask him about his perspective of regulations in preparation for our discussion. And he said, insurance. How do you see the deregulation idea playing out in the insurance world? Is there hope? Because it's bad. You'll hear people say this. I can afford the house, but I can't afford the insurance.
So the insurance paid by the builder or the insurance of the consumer?
On the builder side, it's the insurance regulations for that new build. So for example, we have new regulations around the garage for hurricane mitigation. It's all about hurricanes basically and flooding. And so certain materials have to be used and certain gradients of driveways have to be done, etc. Now for the consumer, it's the premiums. There's maybe one or two companies to choose from and that's it. And if you miss a payment, you're like kicked out forever. It's very severe, even for renters insurance. So there are two different versions of the same problem.
All right. So honestly, I'm going to say that out of the research that I've read, they have not talked about this insurance problem as being that big. My thing is it's probably similar to other issues involving building codes and things like that, where it is a moderate problem, but it's very small compared to I can never get permission to build a skyscraper in San Francisco, or I'm required to put one house on every single acre. As to what is going on with insurance, it is generally a highly regulated industry. It's normal basically for regulators to look at the industry and say, you guys are a bunch of greedy jerks ripping people off, and we're going to breathe down your necks and just be looking to make sure that you're not overcharging anyone. And that is the kind of mentality that discourages firms from entering, that leads to firms exiting. I do have a good friend who works in insurance who just talks about, we don't sell in that state anymore because the regulation is so strict. So insurance regulation is another issue. I think it is small compared to the problem of housing regulation, but doesn't mean that it's not a big deal in absolute terms. At least in some states, the issue is just that the system of civil litigation is crazy and the courts are just handing out very large judgments, making it really hard to go and defend yourself even when you've done everything right. So California is especially famous for having a really screwed up system of making it easy to sue people. Although, like I said, I am much more sympathetic to this older system of suing people than regulation, because at least with suing people, most people, when it comes down to it, say, I'm not going to sue them. It's a good way of getting people to accept, well, my complaint isn't really that important or that good.
Right.
That's really what protected this industry for many centuries, is the burden of proof was on the person complaining. And human beings just have a lot of tendency to making a lot of unreasonable complaints. And it's hard to tell them, yeah, your complaint is unreasonable, go away. Instead, the system is geared towards, oh, you poor person, it's so terrible. Like a story that I heard recently was, there's a developer in Laramie, Wyoming, which is actually an expensive area of Wyoming, who had a big tract of land, wanted to build 30 new houses. And then a bunch of neighbors came and complained to me. He said, no, you shouldn't be able to build any houses there because the light from your new homes will make it harder for us to view the stars. And it's like, and because we don't want to walk another 10 more minutes to go and see stars, 30 houses shouldn't get built. And then the local government said, all right, fine, you can build 23 homes. But basically, this extremely petty complaint prevented 7 homes from being built. And this kind of thing is happening all over the US and the world.
So what about the utility companies? That was something else that I found surprising. Is, again, my husband works in civil engineering, so I have that perspective. And then the builder was telling me that part of the expense for him that obviously raises the cost for the buyer of the home is, okay, now we need to go through the hoops of the water company, now the sewer company, utility company. It just goes down the line. So in your idea of deregulation, is that kind of included in under that umbrella, like that those regulations would be lightened too, because that seems to be connected to the housing price?
I don't know how important those regulations are. I have not heard about them being very important. I mean, the main thing I would say there is there's a world of difference between a builder saying, man, windows are getting really expensive, it's getting hard to do it. It's like, well, but houses have to have windows, and that's just part of doing business, versus I can't get permission to go and put anything on an acre of land. Why not? When people are talking about, well, it's really hard to go and get electrical cables in, it's like, that kind of sounds like your job. On the other hand, the job of, I have to get a bunch of pieces of permission to go and build a skyscraper, it's like, why can't you just build it? So I'd say that is the big difference. Again, there may be some details in the regulation with utilities. Like sometimes there's an issue where when there's a government monopoly supplying it, they just are really hard to get them to do anything.
Yeah, that's the rumor here, is that they're very difficult to work with. But I want to switch gears because I know we're running out of time. I want to ask you about the impact of gentrification, because in areas that are, like for our downtown area, for example, there's families that have lived there for generations, but there's people that are buying up these areas, and the property taxes are going up because they're building new and fancier homes. And then also investors are coming in, buying the rental homes and jacking up the rent price in order to push out the people that can't afford those prices. How does that play into that? Because no one likes that idea, but we all like our downtown area to look nice. But in our downtown area, there's luxury apartments being built. Yay, apartments. I'm not sure I'm that excited about them being luxury. Luxury just means they're very expensive for 800 square feet.
The main thing I would just say about complaining about gentrification is, it's like, look, if there's some people that are building some really nice homes and your complaint is you'd also like to see some more affordable homes built, all right, great. How instead of going and getting angry at people that are building luxury homes, how about you get angry at people that are not allowing the building of non-luxury homes? It is totally possible to approve both. It's true that generally you want to go and put luxury stuff in the most expensive areas because that's where people are willing to pay the biggest premium for it. And you want to go and put the affordable stuff in areas that aren't as nice.
I think what the concern is, though, that I'm trying to work through is not necessarily, is there affordable homes or are there not, which is a concern. But it's more like we're pushing people out on purpose, and that is the solution. Like, that is the solution to make an area nice, is raising the property value so the taxes go up on purpose so that people who have lived there for a long time can't live there anymore.
Right. So, like, here, honestly, I'm just going to tell you what I really think. And it's this. This is standard economics, but people don't like. This is the kind of stuff people don't like economists are saying, but here it is. All progress hurts someone. The internet destroyed the travel agency industry, and you can say that's so terrible. We should go and hold back progress in order to protect travel agents. Or you can say, yeah, well, if progress is happening, then we should just regard this as on balance a good thing. Again, like I said, I can understand the complaint if you're getting approval for luxury development, but not for other development. And that's where I say, look, approve it all, approve everything. Let everyone do everything. And it is true that like if it's really hard to get permission, then when you finally get permission, you probably want to build a luxury place. On the other hand, if permissions are easier to get, then people will build a much wider range of housing. But yeah, I don't think that we should be getting angry at people that take older homes and go and improve them. And worth pointing out, by the way, that almost every time you see affordable housing, it's very rare that it ever started as affordable, because when housing is brand new, it's nice, and then you're going to have richer people living there. Basically, the older housing is, the worse it generally is, and the more affordable it is, and the poorer people live there. And when you go and try to stop people from building luxury housing today, you really are cutting down the supply of affordable housing in 20 or 30 years. So, I mean, it may seem remote, but if people 20 or 30 years ago said, hey, let's not allow anything that's luxurious, then the stuff that is actually affordable today wouldn't exist.
Before we close, are there any final thoughts that you want to leave us with?
The main thought that I'd like to leave you with is this. I'm not sitting around just complaining about regulation, saying, God damn, regulation is so bad. The main point of this book is to show people an awesome world that we could have but don't. It's easy just to be complain, and I don't want to be someone that complains. I want to be someone who says things could be so awesome. It's totally realistic that we could get the price of housing down by 50% so that people who we think of today as having modest incomes could afford large, high quality homes in desirable locations. And that trifecta of cheap, spacious, desirable location, that trifecta is very hard to come by today. And the main lesson of my book is it is totally doable as long as government stops getting in the way. So, and really, whatever you think about regulation in general, this is a very particular kind of regulation where almost anyone, regardless of their political philosophy, studies it, comes away and says, man, government is really screwing this up. Things could be so much better if government would just admit it's made a mistake and get out of the way. And the real problem is just, it's not just government that's making a mistake, it's almost everybody, because this regulation is popular. The main reason I wrote this book is to change that and just convince people, this stuff that you think is wonderful and it's absolutely essential and that buildings be collapsing on people without government. Yeah, that's not really true. Government is the problem here. And if we could just solve the problem, then we could have cheap, abundant housing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing today, and thank you so much for the book. There was so much that we didn't even cover, so I would recommend getting the book. It's a great read for anyone, but I think it would also be a great read for explaining economics to students because it is in a graphic form. You go into how deregulation would impact the birth rate and crime, all kinds of stuff that we just didn't have time to cover. So,
yep. And like even kids like these books. So just today at lunch, I bumped into a family and they said, yeah, our 7-year-old son, he loves your comic books. It's like, all right, great. So I assume he didn't understand everything, but you can get the basic point. So I really wanted to write a book where specialized researchers would say it's accurate and makes good points, but at the same time, even a precocious 7-year-old could go and enjoy the book.
Well, the book is called Build, Baby, Build. I will link it in the episode description and, of course, in my emails that talk about our cliff notes of what we talked about. So thank you again. I appreciate you.
All right. Fantastic getting to talk to you, Meredith. Great questions.